Imagine a world where people did not expect to die at 70 or 80 years old. Imagine attending the funeral of someone who lived 900 years. Imagine great-grandparents still alive, from before entire civilizations were born. This is not mythology. This is not poetry. This is the historical record presented in the Bible. According to Genesis, the earliest generations of humanity lived for centuries. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest lifespan recorded in Scripture. And then, something changed. After the flood, lifespans began to collapse rapidly. Within just a few generations, human longevity dropped from over 900 years to around 120 years, and eventually to what we experience today. So the question is not merely theological, it is historical, it is biological, it is environmental. What happened to the world after the flood? To understand the change, we must first understand the world that existed before it, because the Bible describes a planet that was not just morally different, but physically different. Genesis describes the early earth in a way that raises fascinating questions when read carefully. In Genesis 2:5-6, we are told that before the flood, there was no rain on the earth, but a mist went up from the land and watered the whole face of the ground. No rain, not occasional rain, no rain at all. Instead, the earth was watered by a continuous system, a global hydration process unlike anything we see today. This alone suggests a radically different climate system. Today, rain is driven by evaporation, temperature variation, atmospheric instability, and storm cycles. But the pre-flood world appears to have functioned with stability rather than chaos. Many researchers who study ancient climates, even outside biblical discussion, acknowledge that Earth's past once included what they call a greenhouse uniformity. Fossils show vegetation in places that today are frozen wastelands. Evidence suggests there were once minimal temperature extremes across the globe. No polar ice caps, no violent seasonal swings, no deserts like we know today. Instead, a balanced environment. Now think carefully. If the entire planet functioned like a protected greenhouse, if radiation exposure was lower, if food sources were richer and more abundant, if environmental stress was dramatically reduced, what would that do to the human body? Modern science already confirms that environment directly influences lifespan. We know that. Cellular damage accelerates with radiation exposure. A stable climate reduces physiological stress. Nutrient density affects genetic repair. Air composition influences aging processes. In other words, longevity is not only genetic, it is environmental. The Bible may be describing a world where the conditions for long life were not miraculous, but natural. Genesis also tells us that humans were created directly from the earth itself, formed intentionally, not through a long chain of evolutionary struggle. The earliest generations were closer to that original design, stronger, more resilient, less genetically degraded. Today, geneticists use the term mutation accumulation to describe how harmful copying errors build up across generations. Every generation inherits slightly more damage than the one before. But what if the earliest humans began with no accumulated damage at all? That would mean their biological starting point was vastly superior to ours. This aligns with another observable reality. All systems decay over time unless maintained perfectly. Theological language calls this the fall. Scientific language calls it entropy. Different words, same direction. Things break down. The pre-flood world, however, seems to have delayed that breakdown in ways we are only beginning to imagine. But Genesis gives us another clue, one often overlooked. In Genesis 1:6-7, we read about waters above the firmament. For centuries, readers did not know what to do with that phrase, waters above the sky. But many interpreters now suggest this may describe a vast atmospheric water canopy, a layer of suspended vapor encircling the planet. If such a canopy existed, it would have produced profound physical effects. It would filter harmful cosmic radiation. It would increase atmospheric pressure. It would create a globally stable climate. It would distribute moisture evenly across the Earth. Interestingly, hyperbaric environments, Environments with higher atmospheric pressure are already known in modern medicine to accelerate healing and improve tissue regeneration. Could the ancient world have functioned under conditions that slowed aging itself? The Bible does not present this as speculation. It simply describes the world as it was, a world without storms, without drought cycles, without extreme climate instability, a world designed to sustain life, not fight against it. And humanity, living inside that system, experienced lifespans that now seem impossible. But the story of Genesis is not only about creation, it is also about corruption, because as the generations passed, humanity did not preserve that world. It filled it with violence. Genesis 6:11 says, "The earth was filled with violence." This is not merely moral commentary. It signals a civilization unraveling. And according to Scripture, this corruption reached such depth that the very structure of the world would be judged, not just its people. The coming flood would not be a local disaster. It would be a planetary reset. And whatever environmental systems supported those centuries-long lifespans would not survive it. The question is no longer just, why did people live so long? The deeper question becomes, what exactly did the flood change about the earth itself? Because after the waters receded, the world Noah stepped into was no longer the one Adam had known. And once those systems changed, history would never return to what it had been before. When most people imagine the flood described in Genesis, they picture heavy rain, rising waters, and a large boat floating for many days. But the biblical description is far more intense than that. Genesis does not describe a storm. It describes the collapse of an entire world system. Genesis 7:11 records something extraordinary. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Notice that two different sources of water are mentioned, not just rain from above, but violent eruptions from below. This is not the language of ordinary weather. It is the language of geological upheaval. The phrase "fountains of the great deep" suggests massive releases of subterranean water, water under pressure, breaking through the crust of the earth itself. Today, we know that enormous reservoirs of water exist beneath the surface of our planet. Modern geology has confirmed the presence of deep water storage trapped within rock layers far below ground. If these systems were suddenly released on a global scale, the result would not be gentle flooding. It would be catastrophic restructuring. Continents would fracture, seafloors would rise, land masses would shift, volcanic activity would increase dramatically. This aligns with what we observe in the geological record. Across every continent, we find massive sedimentary layers, rock formed by water-deposited material, stretching thousands of kilometers. These layers often contain billions of dead organisms buried rapidly, not slowly. Fossil graveyards exist where creatures were overwhelmed suddenly, not gradually over ages. Entire ecosystems appear frozen in motion. This kind of burial requires rapid sediment flow, massive water movement, sudden geological displacement. In other words, catastrophe. The flood described in Genesis would not only destroy life, it would permanently alter Earth's structure. Now consider what that means for human longevity. If the pre-flood environment functioned like a protected biosphere, then the flood shattered that protection. The atmospheric canopy, if it existed, would have collapsed. Genesis says, "The windows of the heavens were opened." This could describe the release of that suspended water system. Once removed, the Earth would be directly exposed to forces previously filtered. Solar radiation would increase. Cosmic radiation would penetrate more deeply. Temperature instability would begin. This matters biologically. Radiation damages DNA. DNA damage accelerates aging. Today, scientists identify cumulative DNA damage as one of the primary drivers of biological aging. Cells lose their ability to repair themselves over time. But if radiation exposure dramatically increased after the flood, the human body would begin accumulating damage much faster than before. A lifespan of 900 years would no longer be biologically sustainable. And that is exactly what we see in Genesis genealogies after the flood. Lifespans do not drop instantly. They decline step by step. Shem lived 600 years. Arphaxad lived 438 years. Peleg lived 239 years. Within a few generations, lifespans were cut by more than half. This gradual decline is exactly what we would expect if environmental conditions suddenly worsened. The genetic strength of earlier generations remained for a time, but each new generation inherited more damage, less stability, and harsher surroundings. Something else changed as well. The flood would have reshaped the atmosphere itself. Massive volcanic and tectonic activity would inject enormous quantities of ash, gases, and particulates into the air. This would alter oxygen concentration. Some researchers have proposed that ancient atmospheres may have contained higher oxygen levels. Even small decreases in oxygen availability can reduce cellular efficiency and long-term health. Today we know oxygen is essential for energy production inside cells. Less efficient oxygen use contributes to faster aging. After the flood, humanity would no longer live in a world optimized for life. Instead, they entered a world marked by survival. Genesis 8:22 records God's declaration after the flood. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. For the first time, seasonal cycles are formally introduced. The earth now experiences extremes. Heat and cold, unpredictable weather, agricultural uncertainty. This verse is often read devotionally, but scientifically, it signals a transition to the climate system we know today. The stable world was gone. The post-flood Earth is dynamic, unstable, and far more hostile to long-term biological resilience. And God Himself sets a new boundary for human lifespan. In Genesis 6:3, before the flood fully unfolds, God declares, "My spirit shall not contend with man forever. His days shall be 120 years." This is not merely a warning. It is a new biological ceiling. And remarkably, even with all modern medical technology, humanity still struggles to exceed that limit. Despite advances in medicine, sanitation, and nutrition, the maximum verified human lifespans cluster near that boundary. It is as if we are living within constraints established long ago. But there is another factor we must consider. After the flood, humanity's diet changes. Before the flood, Genesis 1:29 describes a plant-based provision. After the flood, Genesis 9:3 introduces the consumption of animals. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. This signals more than dietary permission. It reflects environmental loss. The earth could no longer sustain humanity the same way it once had. Resources had changed. The biosphere had been damaged. Dietary shifts affect longevity even today. Changes in available nutrition can dramatically alter long-term health patterns across populations. Human beings were adapting to a diminished world, and adaptation often comes with biological cost. So when we read the Bible carefully, we are not simply observing a miracle age followed by normal history. We are witnessing the transition from one world to another. The flood is the dividing line between those worlds. Before it, conditions favored extraordinary longevity. After it, decay accelerated. But the question remains, if the environment changed so drastically, why did lifespans continue to fall even generations later? Why didn't humanity stabilize at 400 years or 300 years? What continued pushing lifespan downward? Because the story of shrinking lifespans is not only about the planet, it is also about what happened inside the human genome after the flood. When Noah and his family stepped out of the ark, they were entering a world that had been physically altered. But there was another change, one that could not be seen with the eyes. Humanity had been reduced to 8 individuals. Genesis 7 and 8 make it clear that only Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives survived. From a biological perspective, this is what scientists call a population bottleneck. A bottleneck occurs when a population is suddenly reduced to a very small number, forcing all future generations to descend from a limited genetic pool. This has measurable consequences. Genetic diversity shrinks. Harmful mutations become harder to eliminate. Certain weaknesses become amplified across generations. Today, conservation biologists observe this problem in endangered species. When only a few individuals remain, long-term vitality declines even if the population later grows again. The human race after the flood would have faced the same challenge. Before the flood, humanity had expanded for many generations from the original created pair. There would have been far greater genetic breadth. After the flood, all future people inherited their biology from just one family. Even if that family was strong, the narrowing itself introduces vulnerability over time. This helps explain why lifespans in Genesis do not merely drop once. They continue to fall steadily for centuries. Let us look at the pattern recorded in Scripture. Noah lived 950 years. Shem lived 600 years. Eber lived 464 years. Peleg lived 239 years. Nahor lived 148 years. Abraham lived 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. This is not random. It is a clear downward curve. And remarkably, the decline slows and stabilizes near the 120-year boundary mentioned earlier. From a scientific viewpoint, this looks like a system reaching a new equilibrium under degraded conditions. But the Bible also records another major event that would influence human biology and environment: the dispersion at Babel. In Genesis 11, humanity gathers to build a city and a tower. In response, God confuses their languages and scatters them across the earth. This event forces rapid migration into dramatically different climates. Some groups moved into cold northern regions, others into arid deserts, others into high-altitude terrain. Suddenly, humanity was no longer living in a single, relatively uniform environment. They were adapting to extremes. Modern research shows that environmental stress triggers genetic trade-offs. Adaptations that help survival in harsh climates often come at the cost of long-term cellular repair and longevity. For example, high UV exposure increases mutation rates. Extreme cold taxes metabolic systems. Nutritional scarcity alters growth patterns. New diseases emerge in new ecosystems. The generations after Babel were not only genetically narrowed, they were environmentally scattered, and dispersion introduces isolation. Isolated populations tend to accumulate unique genetic problems because they intermarry within smaller communities. Again, we observe this effect today in remote populations where certain inherited conditions appear at higher rates. The post-flood world was not simply aging, it was fragmenting. The long-lived patriarchs lived during the transition. Later generations lived fully inside the new reality. Psalm 90:10, attributed to Moses, gives a strikingly honest reflection. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. By Moses' time, the lifespan we recognize today had already become normal. This was not viewed as an improvement. It was seen as a reduction. Something had been lost. Yet even as lifespans shortened, the Bible presents this shift as part of a larger redemptive timeline. In earlier centuries, humans might live long, but moral corruption spread deeply, as seen before the flood. Afterward, human years were fewer, but history began moving toward a specific purpose. From a theological perspective, shorter lifespans restrained the accumulation of unchecked power across centuries. From a biological perspective, humanity had entered survival mode on a harsher planet. These two perspectives are not necessarily opposed. They may describe the same reality from different angles. Today, geneticists confirm that humans are experiencing ongoing mutation accumulation. Each generation carries slightly more genetic copying errors than the one before. We are not evolving toward biological perfection. We are maintaining function despite gradual decay. This aligns closely with the biblical theme of creation subjected to corruption over time. The ancient world described in Genesis was not merely culturally distant from us. It may have been biologically distant as well. But this raises one final and profound question. If human longevity declined because the world changed, could understanding those changes help us better understand our own limits today? And more importantly, what does this tell us about the biblical message concerning life, death, and the future of creation? When we read about the extraordinary lifespans before the flood, it is easy to become fascinated by the numbers alone. 900 years, 800 years, lives that stretched across what to us would be entire eras of history. But the Bible does not record those ages merely to impress us. They are there to show contrast, a contrast between what the world was, what it became, and what it is ultimately meant to be. The long lives of the early patriarchs point backward to an original design, a creation that was not intended to decay. Genesis describes humanity as formed intentionally, placed into an ordered environment, and declared, "Very good." Death is not introduced as a natural partner of life. It enters later, as a consequence of humanity's separation from God. From a biblical viewpoint, aging itself is part of a broader condition of corruption affecting all creation. Interestingly, modern science also recognizes that biological aging is not a single programmed event, but the cumulative breakdown of systems that were once functioning at higher efficiency. Cells lose repair capacity, proteins misfold, DNA accumulates errors, regeneration slows. It is not that the body was designed to fail at a specific moment. It gradually loses the ability to maintain itself. That description resonates deeply with the biblical theme of a creation that is subjected to futility, as later described in Scripture. The flood becomes a historical turning point within that larger story. It marks the end of the first world, a world closer to its beginning, and the start of the world we now inhabit, a world where time is shorter, labor is harder, nature is less predictable, the human body is more fragile. Yet the Bible does not present this as the final chapter. If Genesis shows us the loss of longevity, the rest of the biblical narrative moves toward restoration. The goal is not to return to 900-year lifespans in the present world. The goal is the renewal of creation itself. Throughout Scripture, the hope offered is not merely extended years, but transformed life, life no longer subject to decay. In that sense, the early ages recorded in Genesis function almost like an echo, a reminder of what humanity once experienced in part and what is promised in fullness in the future. From a scientific standpoint, we continue to study aging, environment, and genetics, trying to understand why the human body weakens over time. From a biblical standpoint, the answer is framed not only in biology, but in history and purpose. The world changed. Humanity changed with it, and the decline recorded after the flood reflects both physical and spiritual realities unfolding together. This does not place science and Scripture in opposition. It invites us to examine the same human experience from different levels of explanation. Science observes mechanisms. Scripture provides meaning. Both acknowledge that something about the human condition is not what it once was. Today, despite technology, medicine, and knowledge unimaginable to earlier generations, we still live within the same lifespan boundaries that appeared after the flood. We have learned to treat disease. We have not learned to defeat aging. We extend life by years. We cannot restore it to what Genesis describes. That silence from modern capability is itself thought-provoking. It suggests that what changed after the flood was not a simple variable we can reverse, but a fundamental shift in the world's structure. And that brings us back to the central question. Why did people live hundreds of years before the flood? Because they lived in a world that no longer exists. A world with different environmental conditions, different biological resilience, different proximity to humanity's beginning. And why do we not live that way now? Because we live downstream from one of the most dramatic turning points described in the biblical record. A turning point that reshaped the planet, the climate, and the human story itself. Understanding that shift does more than answer curiosity about ancient numbers. It reminds us that history, environment, and faith are deeply interconnected. The Bible is not only telling us where humanity is going, it is explaining where humanity has been. And when we read it carefully, even its oldest chapters invite investigation, reflection, and thoughtful dialogue with the world we study today. If this exploration helped you see the biblical account from a new perspective, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future studies like this. and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the changes after the flood were mainly environmental, genetic, or something else entirely? I would love to hear how you see it. Until next time, keep studying, keep asking questions, and keep seeking understanding.